So today's first presenter is Professor Dornan, a very well-known scholar, author of very, very important books, Modernity. Professor Dornan is a distinguished research professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis. Among his many works, his books include Marxist Modern, an ethnographic history of the Ethiopian Revolution, Violence in a Time of Liberation, Murder and Ethnicity at the South African Gold Mine in 1994, and then The Erotics of History, an Atlantic African Example. Today, Professor Donald is presenting on Modernity, There Is No There, There. So Professor Dornan, it's so you may start 15 to 20 minutes for the presentation.
I think mine will be a little bit shorter than that, so there'll be more time for discussion, hopefully.
Excellent.
I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. My paper and this panel is devoted to the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 and the student movement that arose in the 1960s. A large and very valuable literature has accumulated on these topics over the last half century. Here, I'll really try to draw back from the particulars of the Ethiopian case to lay out an abstract approach that applies, I believe, to many locations in the world today and to cultural spheres far beyond the political. I do so by focusing on how certain discourses bind time with space, and in so doing, set up particular expectations for the future. After the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, I call these forms chronotopes, literally time spaces. How social actors narrate and experience events, and therefore what they expect of the future, depends, I think, on chronotopes. So the first of these is the notion of the modern. What makes something modern? My answer is that any discourse that successfully casts it as a necessary replacement for something from the past. Technology, for example, is a subject toward which it's easy to take a modernist stance. Many will agree that a tractor-drawn plow should replace an ox-pulled one, or that an iron axe is to be preferred over a flint one. In these comparisons, the notion of progress, quote unquote, inevitably develops, and progress is perhaps the universal marker of the modern. But when we turn from technology to other spheres of culture, what counts as progress is, I think, much harder to discern. But that's hardly inhibited cultural actors across the globe from confidently, but very variously, proclaiming just what constitutes progress with respect to politics or the arts, for example. It's apparently not then the content of things that's been decisive in making them modern. It is rather an associated discourse that successfully casts them as such in particular contexts. Now, the opposite of the modern might be thought to be tradition. What is it then that makes something a tradition? Once again, I think, we discover very little that objectively determines why some practice or idea is thought of as traditional. For example, the ceremonies and rituals in which current British monarchs are installed go back only a century or two. Yet, they're thought of as the very epitome of tradition in Britain. Once again, what makes something a tradition is finally a discourse that successfully casts it as such. Note, though, that such a discourse does not set up expectations for a new and better future, as the modern does. Rather, it looks to the past for the exemplar that should be replicated in the present. Inevitably, men make mistakes. They depart from tradition. But given the shape of time that discourses on tradition construct, we expect not a new future, but a return of the past, a kind of circular history. One might think that the time of tradition comes before the time of the modern. But it's more accurate, I think, to say exactly the reverse. The existence of the modern inspires the construction of tradition. I say this because without the provocation of the modern, tradition hardly exists as a self-conscious project. It is rather the taken for granted in which most people live without too much awareness. To illustrate how the notion of the modern summons a notion of tradition, consider Elizabeth Wolde-Georgis's description of Skünder Bogacian's obsession with Ethiopian magical scrolls. Painted by religious specialist Dabtera on animal skin parchments, the scrolls were stared at fixedly by a patient until the images and writings penetrated and cured the sick person's body. Eyes were the aperture through which this medicine entered the body. Fascinated by this practice, Skünder scraped off the surfaces of parchment scrolls and superimposed his own drawings. But often the outline of the Dabtera's previous work remained visible as a kind of ghostly palimpsest. This kind of drawing over without full erasure captures, I think, the dynamic of the modern and the traditional. In Skünder's case, the Dabtera's work was critical in rendering his modernism is identifiably Ethiopian. Notice that whatever is taken as modern at one moment will inevitably be overtaken by a new definition, given the dynamic of modernism. That is perhaps why our historians refer now to Cubism, not as modern, but as modernist. That last term usefully emphasizes the element of self-consciousness involved in these dialogical encounters. Modernists are aware of various extant possibilities, most notably tradition, and they plot their escape from them. And the modern is always defined in relation to a particular point in space. At other spatial locations, the putatively modern may be taken merely as tradition, that which needs to be superseded and surpassed. Now, I think that the central feature of the approach that I want to construct here is to emphasize that notions of the modern operate like so-called deictic elements in ordinary speech acts. The typical examples of deixis in English are terms like now and then, here and there. What's the meaning of there? It can mean all manner of contradictory things, depending on how the context of speech is understood by speakers and listeners. Understanding context, then, allows particular meanings to be inferred with respect to the otherwise empty deictic elements. The title of my paper is There Is No There There. This is playing on this kind of deictic complexity. There can be then no unitary or essential meaning of there-ness, much less a theory of theirs. The category mistake involved in thinking so, I believe, is exactly the same as that in any theory of modernity. European and North American social theorists have expended a great deal of ink on that project, and some of their results may be insightful for its particular context. But the only general feature of modernity I can see is that it is determined by context. This means, I think, that the role of the analyst is in no way different from any listener who must decipher didactic references like there and here. So what I'm doing, I think, is recasting what a quote theory can be for this particular subject matter. To wind up, let me illustrate just how important context is for considering Ethiopia, say, in 1970 versus today. Then there were two great claims to the future and to the modern. One centered on the US, the other on the USSR. One on liberalism, the other on communism. Since the US had done so much to prop up Haile Selassie, remember that more US aid went to Ethiopia than all the rest of Africa combined at that point. Liberalism had been tainted in the eyes of many in the Ethiopian student movement. Marxism and the apparent successes, at that point they were still, I think, considered successes by many people. Marxism and the apparent successes of the Russian and Chinese revolutions mapped out an alternative future. In other words, it was not the essential meaning of Marxism, however that is understood, that attracted Ethiopians. It was its particular position in the 1960s and 70s with respect to both Ethiopia and the world. Nor was it, I believe, that Ethiopian students had somehow become dislocated from their own cultures, their own culture. They, exactly like modernists the globe over, took up a particular stance toward parts of their present and past in order to begin to imagine a livelier future. So I'm trying to, at that point, emphasize the role of context at a particular historical instance, and that is actually crucial for understanding how the revolution happened and how the Ethiopian student movement happened. Now, in 2020, the bipolar world of the Ethiopian Revolution has now utterly collapsed. The US is currently in the throes of a significant anti-modernist reaction, one in which even medical science is mocked, in which the supposedly rational procedures of the liberal state are being replaced by the circulation of conspiracy theories. There's not much then, I think, that Ethiopian modernists at this point in time will want to emulate compared to the US in the current moment. But that's hardly the case with respect to China and even the Asian tigers. Indeed, those authoritarian successes seemed until recently to provide the model of governance in Ethiopia in what was termed, in fact, the Ethiopian Renaissance. But over the last 2 years, that vision has been rejected by some important sections of Ethiopians for its associations with the TPLF. So what will presently replace the modernism of the developmental state? A populist anti-modernism that somehow reworks a form of get wealthy Christianity, or yet some other secular modernism. Like a great many Ethiopians, I don't know. Whatever happens, though, it seems to me that the dialogical form of analysis that I've laid out will, I believe, continue to provide a necessary framework for understanding how Ethiopian actors understand their time space and how they, at least in part, make their futures and hence dialectically their paths. So this is a short kind of introduction that doesn't cover all of the points that in the longer paper that Shamelis got, but perhaps this will kind of initiate the conversation. Thanks very much.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Dornan. Just on time. In fact, we do have a little more time. So what I will do is, I think, proceed to the next panelist, Professor Eleni Sentim. Let me introduce her. Eleni Sentim is Assistant Professor of African Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University in New York. She is trained in the graduate program in social and political thought at York University, Toronto, Canada, and her research interests include the vernacular politics in the Horn of Africa, critical theory, the Frankfurt School, and the problem of constituting Africa as an objective study. And her first book, which is published in 2020, is Ethiopia in Theory, Revolution and Knowledge Production from 1964 to 2016. She will be presenting today on the very important topic of the Ethiopian Revolution. The title of her topic is Ethiopian Revolution as Rupture or Continuity. So you have 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me here. Thank you to Donald Donham for his remarks, which have inspired me in many ways. I mean, in a different iteration, I suppose your work has had an impact on my work. So it'd be interesting to have a conversation later on. This paper that I'm giving right now is it's a combination of a chapter from my book, the second chapter of my book, plus a paper that is being published in comparative studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It'll be out in December. So the paper that I'm giving today is titled The Ethiopian Revolution as Rupture or Continuity. I think I was trying to play with Christopher Clapham's idea that the Ethiopian Revolution was a continuity of basically the state formation that was initiated by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, way back in the 4th century. So for him, all of these kinds of changes that we've seen in Ethiopia over hundreds of years are just a kind of renewal of the same state process. So I guess I wanted to problematize the concepts of both continuity and rupture by rethinking what those mean in relation to the revolution of 1974. I wanted to begin by discussing a study of trans-border exchanges between Mahdist Sudan and the kingdoms and principalities that are now within the borders of present-day Ethiopia. And the study is by Iris Seri-Hirsch. In the study, Seri-Hirsch shows how the very notion of a border was reshaped by Ottoman and European imperial dynamics on the African continent in the late 19th century. So under pressure from the Ottoman or Turco-Egyptian administration in Cairo, a new notion of territoriality began to sort of emerge in Northeast Africa. And that notion of territoriality is one that relied more on an idea of effective occupation, and that territoriality could be associated with land where Muslims lived. That is, that land could have a fixed cultural identity. And one of the things that Sari Hirsch wants to point out is that within that region, you had other princes, sheikhs, chiefs living in Northeast Africa that were more concerned with an idea of effective control rather than effective occupation. So what does she mean by effective control? She means the capacity to organize raids and to collect taxes. So that any notion of a border would have been understood as an undefined zone extending into neighbors' land. So this idea of overlapping sovereignty. So one of the things that she points out is that by 1876, we find Johannes, who was, I suppose, king of parts of northern Ethiopia. He starts to appropriate the idea of territoriality that's bounded within a limited zone in order to delimit the ways in which the Ottoman Empire was expanding within Northeast Africa. So she quotes Johannes actually speaking to the French council in Massawa in Eritrea. And he is exhorting the European Christian sovereigns to demarcate the borders between Ismail Pasha and Johannes himself. So to demarcate the borders between Egypt and Ethiopia. And so Johannes is quoted as saying, "They, the Christian sovereigns of Europe, will delimit our respective borders. What they do will be done well, and I commit myself not to transgress the limits that they draw for me." So in this statement, we already see some notion of a proto-nationalist state being marked out and differentiated from other regions within Northeast Africa. So a framework is being developed that establishes or that brings together disparate groups in Northeast Africa under the ambit of a clearly designated sovereign whose jurisdiction would not overlap with other sovereigns. Here too, we see the international context of both European imperialism and Ottoman imperialism reshaping social relations internal to a kind of burgeoning nation state in Northeast Africa. So I would say here that the nation state is not an expression of cultural particularism, but is a form through which Johannes or perhaps an African people are able to both insert themselves into an interstate system and make demands on that interstate system. And I see Adom Getachew is here, and this is partially an argument that she makes in her book, World Making After Empire, where she's talking about the nation-state form as having no fixed meaning, and that we see that the nation-state can be appropriated by different thinkers and actors within the African world as a way to reform and to challenge the ways in which international hierarchy is structured. So if European empires were based on some kind of unequal integration into a racialized world-making process, then we can have a kind of anti-colonial nationalism that is an attempt to remake that world. So I think, Partha Chatterjee also makes a similar sort of argument about anti-colonial nationalism as a kind of autonomous discourse, arguing that it's neither derivative nor a simple reproduction of a Western liberal normative order. And yet, given the limits that are imposed by European empire, the internationalization of the nation state shows both creativity and ingenuity, but also it's about that creativity and ingenuity happening within a delimited political space. So what I think the Johannes case that I quoted shows is the way that the international is also rewriting the content internal to what is happening within the nation state form. So we have across a diversity of ethnic groups, princes, sheikhs, laymen, chiefs, and kings in the Horn of Africa, who are actually all participating in the scramble for Africa by attempting to claim sovereignty within an international arena where the apparatus of the nation state is the only mechanism through which this can be done. So the process of nation state building in Ethiopia inevitably marginalizes some leaders while it promotes other leaders. And people who are groups that are being marginalized are, include aristocracies within the traditional orbit of what we might take to be the Abyssinian state. So we can think of the Ethiopian nation state not born out of competing ethnic groups, but born out of this process through which regional hierarchies are being reconstituted by the forces of global history. So this hierarchy, I think, is reflected in the way we tell stories about the Ethiopian past. Certainly within the first wave of sort of modern historical studies about Ethiopia, that wave coincided with a kind of national conviction, but also with an intensification of the state building project within Ethiopia. And the centrality and sort of exceptionalism of Ethiopia, in terms of Ethiopia having a state or having a literary tradition, is foregrounded within those studies. And so we see that Amharic and Tigrinya is foregrounded as important to that exceptionalism, that literacy is foregrounded, but also this area that we might take to be Abyssinia is foregrounded as important to these early studies around these early modern studies of Ethiopia. And in particular, the Abyssinian state-centered histories are foregrounded. But I think one of the things that I argue in my book is that what that has meant is that center-periphery dynamic paradigm has dominated the historiography on Ethiopia. So that the nation state is either under-theorized in Ethiopia as either having continuity from the ancient to the modern, or the nation state is seen as a stage within the telos of human history, led by the center. Or another version of the story can be that the center, the nation state, is a kind of modular adaptation of an original developed in Europe, but again, led by an advancing center. So while the literature on the Ethiopian Revolution does acknowledge, the effects of the central state on borderland communities within a changing global context, very little work has considered how global processes have helped to remake the social and political forces of the central state. Instead, the relationship of the center to the periphery is read as the intensification of age-old tendencies within the Abyssinian state, when it was more likely the result of the activation of new social processes within a global context. So this historiography takes for granted the description of the center offered by the center rather than subjecting it to a broader sociological or historical examination. A crucial question is missed is how are forms of consciousness linked to political practice? In other words, how do the narratives we take for granted about the Ethiopian state link back to actual changing political practice? So one way I try to think through this conundrum in my own work is to argue that the rise of a civilian left in Ethiopia should be seen as part of the continued effort to creatively articulate the shape of the Ethiopian nation state that actually began in the late 19th century with Johannes and Menelik. And I argue that this is why the main agenda of the student movement was how to expand membership within the Ethiopian state, how to reorganize the state to address regional inequalities, and how to build an economy where a newly forming petite bourgeoisie could have a role. So that even if the colonial state in modern Ethiopia Ethiopia had a sporadic existence, the social and political dynamics of the scramble for Africa set the stage for the entire series of actions pursued in the name of state formation from the time of Johannes onwards, or Menelik onwards. The consequence of this constantly contested state formation was that a centralized national identity in formation was continually confronted with other forms of collective identity that ironically began to explain themselves through the homogenizing language of nationalism and ethnicity. And this is, I think, the social and political context that the student movement of the 1960s and 1970s aimed to address. Therefore, I think when I'm paying attention to the student movement and the subsequent 1974 revolution, in my own work, I'm less concerned with asking whether or not the students got their Marxism right, but rather I ask how the students understood the nation state project and how they attempted to transform it. For me, this is about how a new social group and an emerging petite bourgeoisie produced by a new and developing nation state are grappling with the particularities of their social formation. What is interesting is how they made sense of their social position and their emergence vis-a-vis the history of global forces that created this new Ethiopian nation state in the 19th century. It was not a given what the students did or how they envisioned their role, yet a large part of the historiography of the region reads everything that this new social group does as either an analogy of something else. So people like Halliday and Ottaway see the Ethiopian Revolution simply as an analogy that can be compared to the French or Russian Revolution, or the Ethiopian Revolution is seen as simply having a kind of internal logic to it that goes back hundreds of years. And we see this in Clapham, but we also see that in Masai Kabeda. So for me, what is interesting is not whether Ethiopia is like France or Russia, but what this new social group theorized and how they theorized their own crisis and made sense of it using tools and language taken from all over the place. They produced their own literature, they produced their own political theory, not in isolation from the world, but in conversation. Were they good social scientists? Or were they even good Marxists? And I think that's a bad question. The task at hand is to think about their consciousness and to link their consciousness back to the social conditions that they're trying to relate to. So revolutionary processes in Ethiopia, for me, are part of a larger story about the creativity involved in nation state building. Viewed this way, we can draw out the particular ways in which theory transformed practice, but also how practice changed theory on the ground. And this is, for me, this is the terrain on which we must engage the whole of the Ethiopian Revolution. So lastly, I would say that, I was rereading Addis Hewitt's pamphlet about the 1974 revolution that was published by the Review of African Political Economy in the late 1970s. And he was a student leader from the 1960s. And he often referred to the Ethiopian Revolution as a set of popular democratic upsurges. So he talked about different strikes and rebellions and insurgencies that preceded the 1974 revolution. And one of the things that's interesting about Addis Hewitt is that he doesn't spend a lot of time trying to predict outcomes. The bulk of the book or the pamphlet is about him looking backwards and trying to place the 1974 revolution into a historical context. And a crucial part of his argument is that the 1974 revolution must be understood as a revolt against the contradictions of the modern Ethiopian state, whose history, he says, does not extend into a limitless past, but can be firmly established as beginning in the 1890s when Menelik's empire state was finally recognized as a sovereign reality within an international sphere. While Addis Hewitt characterizes Menelik's state as a military feudal centralism, He also distinguishes Menelik state from the pre-capitalist empires we might associate under the different names that Abyssinia has been called. And he does this because the international capitalist imperialism that is defining the age is reshaping what the state means in Menelik's times. So Addis Hewitt writes that the forces that created the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Sudan, and Kenya were the same forces that shaped the creation of modern Ethiopia. He also argues that we must pay attention to the specific ways that those broader historical pressures activated internal social political forces. Crucially for Addis Hewitt, the wars of the 19th century in the Horn of Africa simply mark the processes of establishing the modern state in the first place. So later he says that the fundamental questions of Haile Selassie's regime revolved around the relationship of the provincial rulers to this new central state. And so the crucial questions were, how would tithe and tribute be collected within this within this new state, given that new regions are being incorporated into the empire state? How would the central state mediate relations between local leaders and local traders and international markets? How would the state restructure class relationships as well as labor and land tenure regimes in the various regions that supplied international markets with coffee and, of course, with slaves? Lastly, how would this affect local trade and transportation circuits? In the end, Addis Hewitt argues that it was to Haile Selassie's great detriment that he was unable to address any of these questions that I've just delineated, and he was unable to answer them to any satisfactory degree. And for him, then, this is the background to the 1974 revolution. And in that sense, we can see that there's some continuity of the revolution between what was happening in the late 19th century and in 1974. But again, to emphasize, this continuity does not go back to some kind of ancient conundrum that shaped an Ethiopian state. So I think I'll just end there then.
Okay, thank you, Lenny, for this exciting presentation.
You should say my last name, by the way. My last name is Zaleka, not Santim.
Okay.
Santim is my Betasim.
Betasim, okay. Thank you, Zaleka. Or Lenny for the exciting presentation on the link between what happened in the 19th century and then the revolution in 1974. So that continuity is a very interesting way to look at the experience of Ethiopia in the 1970s. Hopefully we will have interesting conversation on these issues, and the one presented by Professor Dornan. We do have one last presentation today, and that is by Semena Ayalew. Let me introduce Semena Ayalew, and then we will have his presentation. Okay. Semena Ayalew's presentation is it is a presentation on the topic of, okay, just a second, please. Semena Ayalew is presenting on a very interesting topic, which is the entitled Popular Use, Self-Activity, and the Criminalization of Urban Space in Addis Ababa between June and September 1974. June in 1974. Semena Ayalew is a historian of contemporary modern Ethiopia, and a researcher based at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, Addis Ababa University. So we will, I think, I give the floor to Semena to present his interesting paper for
20 minutes, then we will have a discussion. Thank you, Samina.
Thank you, Shumalis, and the previous extremely fascinating presentations. So I apologize for the fact that the image is quite dark, but I was trying to move places, but I couldn't really fix the problem. So you will just listen to my presentation, I mean, with that dim image of myself. So like, as Shumalis said, my presentation is Popular Youth Self-Activity and the Criminalization of Urban Space in Addis Ababa, June to September 1974. June 28 was a momentous day in determining the outcome of the 1974 Ethiopian Revolution. It brought a committee of soldier representatives calling themselves the Derg from the various army divisions located in the various parts of the country. The Derg rose to state power in a revolution that erupted with cascading popular protests that began in February and continued almost uninterrupted until the beginning of May. The subsequent weeks in May and June, however, saw the gradual lulling of protest activity. The Derg have been a key actor in these revolutionary risings. At the same time, however, it posed a serious challenge to the continuity of the very popular protest that brought it to power. The months after the Derg's ascendancy effectively halted the flowering of open protest activities registered in the previous months. As the most perceptive theorist of the Ethiopian Revolution, the one which Santim also referred to, Addis cubed the Derg while trying to maintain security, simultaneously contained and supported the popular movement, he said. By combining various tactics of social control to contain popular protest and by appointing itself in Amharic as Yelaut Mahandis, which literally means the engineer of change, the Derg endeavored and largely succeeded to have the cake and eat it. The first 3 months of Derg's rule that started in June culminated with the overthrow of the emperor in September, were formative and defined the character of Derg's rule for the years to come. They saw the imposition of curfews and ushered in an era where all sorts of youth self-activity and formal political organizing, such as strikes, town hall meetings, and demonstrations, were curtailed. The Derg projected itself as the final representative of popular demands. The intimidation tactics it used, such as military parades, incessant public statements, and warnings, severely constrained political expression of politics, popular expression of politics, excuse me. While this is the more commonly told story that chronicles Derg's draconian methods of stifling popular expression of politics, these months also witnessed the criminalization of key sites of social gathering for the youth. This is a rarely told story that will be the focus of my presentation today. I argue that the Derg went far and beyond targeting explicit political activity, formal political activity, to establish an austere system of social control in the city to discipline, particularly the youth. By examining how sites of social gathering for the youth were preyed upon and disciplined in Addis Ababa, I attempted to tell this story of criminalization of urban spaces in Addis Ababa. For the Derg that had the goal of achieving a more complete control of popular self-activity and energy, one target was the unwed youth, whose superfluous energies it was determined to contain and discipline. One may ask why it was important for the Derg to control this section of urban society in the first place. The answer lies in the proved disobedience of the group that I like to call the Unrest Youth. This category includes school students, the unemployed, the street hustlers of all types, as well as the precariously employed, such as coolies and errand boys. This disparate group gave the popular protests since February 1974 continuity. This was the case, for instance, even in the weeks after mid-May that saw dwindling strike action due to the preponderance of military personnel in political affairs. The unwedged youth maintained their constancy throughout the 5 months of popular protests, that is between February and June 1974, giving them their mass base. The Derg's method to control the restive unwedged youth was endeavored through criminalizing their life activity and their sites of congregation. A month after the Derg seized state power, Addis, the daily voice of the state, started a moral crusade that justified the need for the state to control the activity of those between the age of 12 and 17. This group was already active in protest, mainly through class boycotts and street riots in the preceding months. On its July 29, 1974 issue, Addis claimed that the urban sites of get-together for high school students and teenagers were bastions of what it called criminal activity and indecent behavior. It said, I quote, "In tea houses or shaybetoch, in the hidden neighborhoods of Addis Ababa, we find youth between the age of 12 and 17 ducking classes and wasting away their golden time in shenanigans and ballyhoos." The paper argued that criminal activity of these teenagers was a product of smoking and chat chewing. It said that the government is determined to take action against these sites that it called a menace to society. A few days later, Police and Narmijao, Police and its Measures, a bi-monthly paper published by the Ethiopian Police Force, came out with similar reports prohibiting those between the ages of 12 and 17 from going to tea houses. Curiously, these reports came out at a time when schools were closed for the cramped break. More importantly, however, they came out along with other reports that criminalized bars, nightclubs, drinking parlors, and sex work, as I will discuss shortly. The Derg's need to discipline this lot, teenagers and school students, should be seen in the context of what transpired in the preceding months. It is apparent that Derg's attempt to monitor and penalize this social group was predicated upon the role the unwedged youth played in the popular protest. School students and teenagers enlisted thousands of dissidents in the popular protests. They provisioned the popular rebellion both by withholding their tacit compliance to state power through class boycotts and by occasionally putting their bodies out in the streets for demonstrations and riots. One key example in this regard was the role of the unwedged in the taxi strikes of February 18, 1974. School students and the unemployed, according to police reports and newspaper columns, were the group responsible for the mayhem in the capital that lasted for about a week. Particularly alarming for the state was the riot activities of this group and their destruction of public and private property. The rioters were branded in official statements as students who failed in their responsibilities, and as idling hoodlums. It is worth noting here that these reports by state organs acknowledge the intimacy and social ties commonly shared between the unemployed, the precariously employed youth, and school students. They recognize that class boycotts and street uprisings were interlinked. These social groups gave the protest movement its fuel, even when most strikes, as I have already mentioned, were ended in the weeks after mid-May. And the continuity of the popular protest was not just a product of the hard-to-control class boycotts. It was also, it was also a product of the street hustlers, coolies, and the unemployed youth joining ranks with school students, as Addis called it, disturbing the peace of schools and their surrounding neighborhoods. These riots and erratic street outings not only disturbed the peace, they were also too difficult to power over as they were operated through informal social networks and hence tended to be spontaneous. This disparate social group was among those that made the Ethiopian Revolution, as Addis would say, phenomenal in its spontaneity. The Derg assailed the cultural bulwark of the unwedged youth, this persistent source of menace to authority, by trying to subdue their rebel sensibilities. What the Derg did was force their obedience or channel their energies to its own use. The alleged 6% spike in criminal activity in this protest year, 1974, from the previous year, appears to have provided the Derg with a justification to criminalize spaces of social activity that the youth frequented. The pages of Addis Zaman, Police and Narmijau, and Yazare to Ethiopia flaunted reports, editorials, and news on the infirmity of urban spaces, not just targeting tea houses, but also shebins, bars, and nightclubs in July, August, and September, and also the following months. The imposition of curfews in the capital were meant to regulate movement as well as censor and penalize the daily life activity of the youth and those who operated these spaces, such as female brewers and sex workers. It was argued the proliferation of sex work, drinking parlors, and nightclubs during the post-war imperial period was a deliberate scheme, as Addis Zaman called it, to slacken the morale of the youth. In a report that initially came out in Yazare to Ethiopia in late August and picked up and publicized by papers like Addis Zaman, it was claimed that big cities sheltered more than 100,000 drinking parlors and 337,000 prostitutes. It is evident from the extravagant figures and the hyperbolic language of the report that it furnished the Derg with propaganda that accused the imperial regime for sponsoring the moral degeneration and indolence of the youth. The report justified the Derg's rhetoric and action that criminalized spaces of the city, such as bars, nightclubs, shebins, and interdict sex workers as deviants. This further restricted movement and activity of the youth. Yazare to Ethiopia rebuked the imperial regime for permitting the youth to lead a life of idleness just to extend its reign. Sex work was seen as corrupting and degenerative, and its eradication was called for. Controlling sex work and alcohol consumption was a matter requiring, as an Addis Zaman editorial called it, a high-level national attention. All this rhetoric justified the Derg's criminalization of sex workers, women brewers, particularly of spirits like katikala, as well as spaces of social drinking. Determined to stem the tide of popular protest and neutralize the self-activity of the youth, the Derg regulated, monitored, and attacked its spatial centers with the aim of enforcing their tacit compliance. Those figures who moved in the hidden spaces and interstices of the city, vagrants such as the China Group, Congo Group, and other organized, semi-organized gangs who survived the city as outlaws, joined leftist political organizations in the months and years following September 1974. Members of the China Group, for instance, became targets of Derg's brutal killings during the terror years between the 1976 and 1978. Other sections of the Unrest Youth were wooed by Meison, the All Ethiopian Workers' Party, and the Derg to stuff the Kabale County administration, as well as killing squads in Addis Ababa and other cities and towns throughout the country. As René Lafort, writing in the 1970s, argues, these tilted the balance of power in Derg's favor against their mortal enemy, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. While Meison and the Derg tried to channel the energies of the unwaged youth to score points against their rivals, sex workers that were targeted by the Derg were courted by civilian political organizations such as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, as Surafel Wendemu observes. And throughout its rule, the Derg would continue its effort to prevent and eradicate sex work. While criminalizing urban spaces, youth outlaws, and places of social congregation for the unwaged youth might have aided the Derg's social control over these subjects. Such methods would not have been enough to stop school students from weaponizing class boycotts. And as discussed above, class boycott had been that elusive mode of protest that gave the popular protest continuity. School students, despite repeated threats, continued their class boycotts throughout May and June. In these formative months, the Derg also announced the National Development Campaign Program, what is popularly called the Edgat Behebrat. This announcement that came in August, just before the start of the following academic year, was aimed at channeling the militant spirit of the youth to advance Derg's goals. This campaign summoned thousands of high school and college students to march for the countryside to realize Derg's socialist development agenda. And the 1974-75 academic year went quietly without registering either class boycotts or successful strikes of any serious significance. In January 1975, the campaign started and dispatched thousands of students to the countryside, removing high school students, the force behind the impeccable school boycotts from big cities, effectively making class boycotts a non-issue for that academic year. That is 1974, 1975. So in conclusion, the unwaged youth, restive, feisty, and wayward, lent the popular movement their energy and rebelliousness. After the summer of social protests, February to June 1974, school students went to join the Edgat Behebrat campaign. A section of the unwaged youth saw their lives sequestered by Derg's suffocating moralist state measures. Others got involved in political activities of the different civilian political organizations, including SADAT, which is the Derg's political wing. As a consequence, in the years that follow, many suffered the Derg's brutal repression, while others became part of its apparatus of social control. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Simene. Just on time. Thank you very much to the presenters for their excellent presentation on a very important topic of modernity. Ideas is important, but contested ideas of modernity and modernism and the modern in the context, in the case of Professor Dornan, and then nation making and the revolutionary experience, which Lenny discussed in some detail, and then the role of the youth, and particularly what Simene called the unwaged youth during that particular moment in the Ethiopian Revolution, the 1974 period. I will not delve into any detailed commentary, but I will have at least one question for each of the presenters, and then let the participants participate in the conversation on the basis of the presentation. So let me begin with the Professor Dornan's presentation. By the way, meaning the three papers, the three presentations do have a conversation. I mean, I do see a conversation among the three papers, but and particularly, in fact, I was thinking about a kind of conversation between Eleni's discussion of the haunting and the laws captured in this notion of the zita with the ideas of lagging behind and catching up, which discussed in some detail in the Professor Dornan's discussion, and you probably will have that kind of conversation today. So let me begin with the Professor Dornan. This is a very interesting presentation on the evolving contradictory meanings of these concepts of the modern and modernism, modernity used in multiple contexts, both in the Western world, but also in the Ethiopian African context during the time of the Sura movement, but also during this period of missionary presence in the southern parts of the country, in this particular area called the Mali, or the community called Mali, and also the arrival of the Marxist regime in that area in the 1980s. So it's a very interesting discussion and very relevant discussion, as Professor Dornan mentioned, especially at the end of his paper. In fact, he said at the end of his paper that he doesn't have an answer for what kind of, he raised a fundamental question, and the question was, what will presently replace the modernism or the developmental state, the developmental state in Ethiopia? He was playing with terms like whether it would be a populist anti-modernism or yet another modernism, or I may also add a form of anti-modern modernism. So I would be happy if Professor Dornan say a few words about the possibilities, the potential for a new kind of understanding, a radical understanding of modernism, or the modernist experience in this period of this post-global period, a post-global or a post-Cold War period, or a kind of a post-American global order. But my question specifically is, there is this discussion about the Mali community, a community who had a circular declining view of time in which, I'm quoting Professor Dornan, Mali had a circular declining view of time in which the charisma of a king's firstborn successors inevitably sank in comparison to the magical acts of the first king. So my question is, how would this conception of a declining time coexist with their new notion of besting, besting or supersession, or I think it's called bashan in the local language, in which the latest guns, the guns that they had acquired, the British guns bested the first guns, the guns they had acquired later on, meaning from the Russians or for the Americans. Because my understanding from that discussion, was that meaning the earlier or the first accusation is better than the accusations that come later on. And so can the Mali be considered modern or modernist based on this assumption, the modernist assumption of cascading or improving time, a kind of a linear or progressive construction of time, or an accumulation of better times? Because there is a change. I think you did talk about this change of understanding, conception of time in the Mali community. The circular time that they had practiced changed in the 1970s with the arrival of the missionaries and the Marxist regime in the 1980s. So a little more, probably a little, if you say a little more about that, it would be interesting. That's for Professor Dornan. For Eleni, again, as I said, it's a very interesting discussion on nation making. This is a time when we have this fractured, very contested understandings of the nation building process in Ethiopia and the revolutionary experience in the country. And particularly impressed by your book, your recently published book. So my question, probably not directly related to the presentation today, but it's largely about knowledge production. Can we argue that our understanding of the political process, for instance, the nation building process in Ethiopia between the time of the scramble for Africa in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and the revolutionary experience in the 1970s and the 1980s, is constrained or impoverished, theoretically impoverished by frameworks, conceptual containers, frameworks that probably don't fully capture the historical complexity of the period. Like terms like empire or the nation state. Are these two theoretical containers successfully contain the complexities of the Ethiopian political experience of the 1890s and the period after? Can we say, for instance, meaning I'm working on a manuscript that says Ethiopia is neither a nation nor an empire. Because I find these terms, these concepts like empire and nation, very weak theoretical containers. So that one thing about that. The other is, you were talking about the under-theorization of the nation state, that the nation state is under-theorized, not just in terms of, in the sense of references to the exceptionalism or exceptional story of the Ethiopian state in terms of its uninterrupted existence, its independence, or its claim to cultural distinctiveness. But what about this conception, the under-theorization of the nation state on the basis of the assumption, this dominant hegemonic assumption that everything began, the nation building process began in the 19th century under the gaze of a global capital, a global capitalist system. Are we not limiting ourselves in these two very constraining binary oppositions between the remote past, which is considered to be the birth, the beginning of Ethiopian empire, especially the mainstream understanding of the Ethiopian state, and then the 19th century, another important theoretical container for understanding the rise of the modern Ethiopian state? Is it possible to get out of these theoretical binaries and find a more inclusive vocabulary of social analysis. And then finally, Semena. It's a very interesting, and this is something that I feel affiliated with because of his discussion of the urban space, a revolutionary urban space in Ethiopia, and the youth and politics. A very interesting discussion, and I'm happy to listen to that. And there is one question, particularly in light of this the global importance, the growing importance of youth in social movements, especially over the last few years, and also going on at the present, and including in neighboring countries like the Sudan, but also within Ethiopia itself, like the youth movement that eventually ended up in changing government in 2018. So what minor question about that is if he does see any connection between what happened in the 1970s and what's happening now within and outside of the country, but more specifically about my interest in how these youth, meaning the wage youth that you talked about, were politically socialized and mobilized in that period, in that historical moment in the Ethiopian history. Interested in the political socialization of this community, this group, the unwaged youth, and that probably would explain their political mobilization in the following months. Thank you very much.
Well, I would be very hesitant to say anything about the present. I'm sure those of you located in Addis Ababa will have a much finer and closer kind of appreciations of the sort of contradictory moment. So I would obviously defer to you on that question. On the question of Male, it's a part of my paper that I didn't cover in the oral kind of synopsis, the idea of anti-modernism. And the way I understand that concept is that it's a rejection of the modern. So we're still in this situation of a kind of dialogical conversation about various positions. But it's a rejection based not in the past, but in some ways that depends on the modern, if you can see it that way. And the example that I give in the longer paper is Western missionaries that came to Ethiopia in the South in the 1930s. They came from a very particular theology that called itself anti-modern. These were the so-called fundamentalists around the turn of the century in North America, who were reacting to a version of Christianity that had been described as modern, and thought of themselves as incorporating the insights of, say, history or archaeology or textual criticism in order to understand the scriptures in a way that harmonized with other kinds of knowledge. So in that sense, the 19th century threw up a version of modernism in Protestant Christianity itself. Well, what happened in the early 20th century in North America is that there was a group of Christians who rejected that. No, the scriptures are literally true. You can't reinterpret them in these kind of modernist terms. So they were explicitly reacting to another position. But they didn't have a view of rejecting modernity. And when they came to Ethiopia in the 1930s, they almost reveled in bringing things like automobiles, medicine. In fact, a lot of the missionaries were doctors themselves who began to provide medical services to people in the South. This was with Haile Selassie's explicit kind of approval. And of course, they were shunted into non-Orthodox areas of the South, where they begin to provide these services and so forth. My point was that they lived at a level of technology and wealth that in literally no representative of the local state could match. So that put them in a very kind of unique position, I think, versus Southerners, who ironically did not see them as anti-modern. In fact, they were kind of hyper-modernist to Southern Ethiopians. So once again, the relativity of how these concepts can actually change into their opposite, given a particular kind of context, I think is important. So that the process of conversion then starts, say, in the late 50s, into the 60s. And the kind of cultural impetus for that is highly modernist. So now we have this small group of converts who are beginning to be able to read Amharic, the Bible in Amharic. They are beginning to see themselves as a wider part of Ethiopia. Being in this kind of Protestant community and the links that it gives has all kinds of advantages for travel and for dealing with the state and so forth. And so this highly kind of modernist form of Protestant Christianity is there in the South on the eve of the revolution. So what happens? This other Marxism as another kind of modernism comes in. And given the new state, there's a lot of pressure against Protestant Christians. In fact, they're called an incoming religion, right? Something that's foreign, and so there's a distinct repression of that kind of Christianity. What has always fascinated me is that when the Workers' Party of Ethiopia was established locally in the 1980s, every last one of them were ex-evangelicals. Every last one of them. There was no exception. They were all from that. So what this kind of emphasizes for me is, again, it's not so much the content that seems to me critical. It's the shape of time. So these people already had this view of time, right? So it was relatively easy for them to take up Marxism, even though in terms of contents, there was just a radical difference between the two. So this is a kind of illustration, I think, of how the casting of time is really crucial. And it's sometimes we don't, I think, realize that when we kind of give, when we assume there's a there, right? So this kind of example that happened in the 60s through the 80s might have relevance today. I mean, who knows how some of these positions can kind of meld into something that on the face of it looks incredibly different. But in terms of how time and space are kind of constituted, perhaps this is Santim's questions of continuity and breaks, you know? Yes, on one hand, it's a huge break, but on the other hand, maybe it's not. Maybe it's one of these continuities. So, as I say, I don't know enough about the present to really begin to flesh out an argument. I'll leave that to you and Addis Ababa, but I wonder whether this way of kind of approaching it might lead to some new insights.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask a
Lenny?
question to Donald Donham? Is that like a thing that I'm allowed to do?
Oh yeah, it's a conversation.
A conversation.
So,
Because I mean, I see Donald Donham offering a method for analysis, if I'm right, right? By positing modernity as a constantly shifting sort of position that is being re-articulated by different groups according to different stakes, and then what the role of the analyst is to think about the position of the person articulating the project of modernity, and the wider context in which they're doing it. But I mean, I guess, Donald, I've always had this question with your work in some ways, is that I'm never sure what the analyst is in this kind of dialogical process that you're trying to trace, what the role of the analyst is in all of this. Like, so is the analyst constituted by these processes as well, that they're trying to trace, or is the analyst somehow outside of those processes and able to trace out something because they're an analyst?
That's a really hard question, a really good question, because of course, in some ways, analysis can become exactly a kind of social actor in the process. It's struck me continually, for example, in thinking about history and historians, how certain kind of approaches to the past are intensely political in the present. So you're quite right to draw that. As for myself, I think my goal has never been simply to kind of intervene politically. And I've always actually been quite skeptical of that, and tried to kind of develop even though in some ways I saw myself as a Marxist, I realized that what Marxism meant to Ethiopians was incredibly different from what I took it to be, right? And in fact, it was that kind of contradiction that led me to, I think, to this approach. So I don't think that there's any easy answer to that question, because there is, I would say, inevitably a political aspect of the way we take these things up. I'm probably not conscious of all the ways in which my position is political. But I certainly wouldn't say that that the analyst has had any kind of super privileged position in this. That's a great question.
Yeah, so maybe that connects back to maybe questions that Shamelis was asking me, but also some questions that were in the Q&A chat. Because I think I am actually concerned with the idea of analysis as being a social actor in the world. So I am concerned with the ways in which the student movement is using analysis to make moves in the political sphere. And I think the question for me is, how do they understand analysis? But also, how is their own understanding of analysis related to the social conditions that they're attempting to address? So not just how do they address those social conditions, but how are those social conditions themselves constitutive of the very questions that the student movement is asking, right? Which is a different thing from just saying that the student movement can ask questions, that the social environment in which they live in is providing the form through which they're asking questions. And in many ways, that form, I'm trying to argue, starts to emerge, I think, at the time of the Ethiopian nation state taking on the form of the European nation state. And I think that we can argue that something like a European nation state is adopted, you know, in the late 19th century and in the 20th century, because the Ethiopian nation state starts to take on certain institutional forms that are very much, you know, what we take to be the universal nation state today. So there's that. And I think for me, I don't see talking about the nation state or capitalism as like miring myself in a set of dichotomies that say that, you know, there is modernity on one side and, you know, whatever, some other thing on the other side, or there's, you know, I mean, I do think something like capitalism and its universalizing tendencies is a real social force in the world, and that starts to reshape the ways in which people are acting in the Horn of Africa in the late 19th century. And I don't want to, I wouldn't want to reduce capitalism to just a set of discourses. It's a set of practices as well. And those practices are something that people are attempting to grapple with in the late 19th century in Ethiopia. And it's reshaping the nature of state formation in that region at that time. And it continues to shape the kinds of questions and the ways in which institutions are formed in the Horn of Africa today. So somebody had asked me in the Q&A as well around why I mentioned Johannes and why I didn't mention Tewodros and so on. And I mean, this is a brief paper, and I'm not trying to exactly locate the point where the Ethiopian nation state emerges, or where a kind of modern nation state emerges in Ethiopia. I was simply trying to point out that something is starting to shift in the late 19th century, and a certain kind of language around the nation state is being adopted by people like Johannes. So that, I mean, there's a book by Herbst on the African state, and he talks a lot about this idea of overlapping sovereignties that would have existed within the African context prior to European colonialism and the modern nation state coming into existence in Africa. And I think that idea of overlapping sovereignty does tell us something about a different kind of state that might have existed in Africa, whereas now what we have in Africa is a nation state that is very much territorially bounded. And I think that matters in terms of you know, how identity is understood and how culture is understood as, you know, being contained within the idea of a nation state. So what else? And I think for me, you know, when I talk about capitalism and imperialism and colonialism rewriting the constituent elements of what is internal to Ethiopia or to the Horn of Africa, what I'm trying to say is that there is continuity. It's not as if Europe or the Ottomans or whatever showed up in Africa and found nothingness. Of course, there are many institutions and practices that exist in the Horn of Africa at this time. But what I am suggesting is that to simply see those practices as having continuity is to ignore the ways in which they're being reconstituted, given the ways in which global forces are bearing down on the local, right? So the local is never just the local. The local is obviously being transformed through its interactions with the rest of the world, right? Which I think obviously is Donald Donham's point when he's thinking about the Ethiopian Revolution in the context of Mali, right? He's trying to think about how local practices take on new meanings because of the revolution and so on. So in that sense, to simply say these are the ways in which the Mali respond to the revolution is just, you know, something indigenous to Mali is to do disservice to the ways in which actually those processes are dialogical and dialectical. So I think perhaps I'll just maybe end there. I hope I answered these questions.
Okay, thank you. Samena? Samena, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Shimalis, to try to respond to Shimalis' extremely interesting question. I mean, the contemporary global moment and how it structures basically young lives is a very interesting area to put a lot of thinking into to understand the Ethiopian context, the African context, etc. Right? So the African context is quite very, very interesting in terms of theorizing about the political role, the role of the youth in transformation of society, social change, and political change in general. So I mean, it's such a grand question. It's not. I don't think it is a question. Also, it's more like a comment, and that perspective is extremely interesting to understand. Ethiopian realities as well. So I hear you, but in relation to that, what you've said about the political socialization of the youth, if I understood what you mean by that correctly, what is extremely interesting in the case of Ethiopia, particularly in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, is so basically a certain vanguardist perspective and agent of revolution is basically imposed to understand political and social change, the revolution, for instance, in 1974, right? So what is extremely interesting is their own self-activity is obscured that way. You know what I mean? Were they not present while all these social and political changes were happening in the 60s, 70s, and particularly in 1974? So basically what I'm trying to do is basically unravel, the self-activity of the youth and how it kind of articulated with other makers of revolution, for instance, soldiers, students, like, university students and so on. So this is another point that I wanted to make in relation to your question. The other thing is demographic factors. I mean, so when you look at, the youth on the continent in Africa, so it's a very important social force, right? I mean, it's one of the youngest, definitely the youngest population, the youngest continent in the world, right? Africa. And Ethiopia also has a very, very large young population. So demographic factors have to be taken into account also in understanding political processes and political change. And the making of urban spaces, the process of urbanization that is understood without taking into account demographic factors would be also quite limited in the way it illuminates, political and social processes, cultural processes happening in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, as well as now in the present moment. Yeah, but there are questions coming from, other
Yes, there are questions. So what I will do is read them. So the first batch of questions is for Professor Dornan. So let me begin. First question. First question is from Tafari Abata. Could you also discuss the articulation of modernity in the day-to-day administrative practices of regimes beyond the ideology of each regime you discuss eloquently? So could you also discuss the articulation of modernity in the day-to-day administrative practices of regimes, which is beyond the ideology of each regime? So that's one question from Tafari, but there are others, a few others. So I will go to read it. Yeah, there is another question also, related question from Robil Taklab.
Okay.
The question is, modernity in the Ethiopian context of the 60s and the 70s has been articulated by an Eritrean writer, Yosef Gebrehiyot, as a rejection of all wisdom of traditional culture and its evolution as backward, by the use of the 60s and the 70s in favor of a socialist utopia that contains Western technologies symbolized in flashy buildings and technologies. So how does that contrast with your assessment as rejection of liberalism due to its support for Haile Selassie in favor of the socialist East? So that's from Robil Taklab. And then let me say another one. So these are for you. So 2 questions for Professor Dornan, and then there are a set of questions for Lenny and for Selena. So Professor Dornan, you can go ahead.
Thank you. On the last one, the thing that strikes me about that position is the rejection of all wisdom from the past. I'm skeptical of such either or kind of contrasts. I mean, I've always been struck, in fact, of the irony of how, even for those who might have taken such an extreme stance at one point, how at other points, actually, there's much left from the past and so forth. So I don't see this rejection as a simple rejection. It's an ambivalent and complex and contradictory kind of rejection. So to the extent that the author, as mentioned, would kind of take that more extreme view of rejection, I would tend to suggest that if you look deep enough, there's going to be more complexities than that, which is important, I think, to realize, because that actually then affects how people act in certain situations and so forth. So yes, there is a close resemblance between those 2 arguments, but I'm not familiar with the work cited in specific, but that's one way in which I think my position would probably differ from it, if I have understood it correctly. The second, Teferi's question about administration. This, I suppose, it's not so much a matter of kind of what's modern and what's not, although perhaps it is actually, as I'm thinking of it. But this, one of the things that I point in my book is that one of the real changes of the revolution in Mali is how the state begins to penetrate local communities with an efficiency that they never had before. I think in imperial Ethiopia, the state kind of floated on these local areas without much attempt to really penetrate and control things and so forth. That dramatically changed, I think, in the revolution. And I suppose that had to do with the note that there's a modern attempt to kind of guide and control and so forth. Maybe along the ways that Semena talked about the Derg in your very interesting analysis of that early period in the revolution, that they were already taking this view, right, of trying to kind of mold this group that they feared in some ways, and to divide them maybe with the Samecha and so forth. I think those are these are not, as Santini said, it's not so much that these are ideas or discourses, they're practices. And their practices probably the people in the state saw as modern, right? Of being able to use the state to create a new future.
Okay, thank you. So then there are a few more questions for Eleni. So I will read them. We do have only about 15 minutes, so so let me, yeah.
I do feel like I actually incorporated many of those answers or questions into my last answer because I had read them before. So maybe we could go to and then maybe come back to me, or if we want, if we have time.
Okay. Okay, I can do that. So let's begin. So let's continue with the Semena. For Semena, question for Semena. There is a question for you from Sarah, Sarah Marzagora. The question is, you show how moralizing narratives were deployed by the Ethiopian media against the urban youth, and how these moralizing narratives were later picked up by the Derg in its attempt to criminalize protest. On the side of the urban youth, to what extent did they make a point of deliberately challenging this hegemonic morality or moral conservatism? Did the challenge become more deliberate the more the media were disparaging their habits and behaviors? And was the challenge to hegemonic morality important in creating a sense of class, group consciousness for the youth themselves? So that's one question. Lots of questions, of course, for Semena from Sarah. Another is from Bahailu. When you say disciplining the youth, I believe you meant it in the Foucauldian sense. That's a question. Is it in the Foucauldian sense of the term? So second question. Third question is from Samuel Tagai about your presentation about the unwaged, the precariously employed sex workers during the early years of the Derg regime. Reminds how the debates about modernity or Silitane in Eritrea during the 1940s was very much preoccupied with mastering, disciplining, controlling lazy young men, sex workers, uncivilized peasants, etc. I'm wondering if the Derg's impulse to control and discipline this group of people was associated with its conception of how modern citizen subjects are supposed to behave. That's from Samuel Sagai, using the Eritrean example. There is a question on the chat from Surafel to Semena. How, when you call the unwaged youth, and in particular, and the declassing in general, how did these the unwaged youth in particular and the declass in general figure into and interact with the highly valorized student movement and with the political groups that emerge out of that movement? So 3 sets of questions for Semena. So we do have only about 15 minutes, maybe in 5 minutes maximum.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, these are extremely interesting questions. The question about the comparison that a colleague is perhaps seeing with discourses in Eritrea in the 1940s, it's quite interesting. So I mean, the term that Surafil has just mobilized is declassing. I mean, the Derg, particularly during the 17 years of its rule, categorized sex workers, vagrants, beggars as part of the declassing. So basically, they were seen as a lumpen proletariat that can be mobilized by anyone. It's a very Marxist kind of analysis that they had during the, after the 1976, 1977 particularly. But when the Derg was talking about the unwaged in those very moralizing terms, what it was trying to do is say that, you know, the imperial regime has made young people indolent to basically extend its reign. And basically what it is saying is that these are degenerates, they are not Ethiopian enough. So if Derg was through and through very, very Ethiopian, so these are not authentic Ethiopian practices, life activities, you see what I mean, you know, smoking and chewing chat. I think that's how it was mobilized in 1974. But the meaning of the declasse and how they were treated during the Derg period after 1977, I think evolves for different reasons. Also because the Derg has really incorporated lots of Marxist instructions also by that time. So yeah, so I see some kind of evolution. So it's not necessarily a monolithic story in that sense, but it's a great question. So the question by Sarah is also extremely interesting. So she's asking, were there deliberate challenges, you know, to mock the state, basically, speak back against its moralizing discourse. So basically what I look at, the sources that I am trying to mobilize in constructing this paper is newspapers. And these newspapers only reflect the position of the state. So basically what I use is Yazare to Ethiopia, Addis Zaman, and Police and Armija. So what I have is the state discourse. It would be extremely interesting to explore, you know, how, you know, young people basically spoke back to that kind of discourse by the state. But for the previous decade, the post-war decade, particularly after the 1950s into the 1970s, there was an attempt to rebel against the normative cultural order of the autocratic imperial state and its modernizing prescriptions and impulses. For instance, Chawadnet, it's like, you know, respectability politics of the modernist impulse of this autocratic imperial state were really, you know what I mean, rebelled against for instance, in places like Wuwe Barha, you know, which basically, in a sense, re-evaluated the values of that imperial order. So yeah, so I can say that about the previous period, not necessarily about the latter one after 1974, because I have not exactly studied what really transpired after the 1974 revolution. So my focus has been until 1974. So the other question by Bahailu, you are right. I mean, disciplining in the sense that, you know, trying to make obedient, disobedient, recalcitrant young rebels, you see what I mean? So that's how I'm using the word disciplining. That's the meaning that I'm trying to give it. The other question is by Surafel. And, you know, the unwaged basically, I mean, the relationship with the unwaged by various political organizations after the 1974 revolution is quite interesting, as your own work, Surafel, shows. So, I mean, the various civilian political organizations have tried to woo sex workers, for instance, into their, to advance their own political agenda. But the tendency has been generally to look at them as the declasse. They were not really seen as people who generated social and political change that is progressive. So I can generally say that, yeah. For interest of time, I have stopped. Thank you for the great questions.
Okay. Thank you, Samena. I'm not sure because Larry had another meeting in probably less than a minute or in a minute. Do you have time probably to answer just one question? There is one from Hewan. I don't know if you responded to that, but I do see a question from Hewan Samon. You mentioned Johannes and Menelik repeatedly in your talk. Is there a reason you do not start with Theodore II and Tekle Georgis? Also, what do you think of the historian Meredith Laragai's theory that through the Chawa warriors, Ethiopians demarcated land based on an understanding of territoriality since the Ethiopian Middle Ages? We can also add Sahai Brahma Selasis and Veres Ayenaicho's works on the Chawa here.
Sure. I mean, I thought I did answer that question when I was talking about overlapping sovereignty, and the ways in which sovereignty becomes much more linked to a particular kind of cultural identity within the I guess the 20th century, and the ways in which the Ethiopian state starts to look like the European nation state in terms of its institutional formation. So I guess that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that I did answer that question again by saying I wasn't actually focused on trying to find one moment of the emergence of a modern nation state in Ethiopia. I used the example of Johannes as a kind of exemplary moment to help us think about the ways in which internal social relations are being reconstructed, rather than thinking of it as a kind of radical break. As Ethiopia is interacting with the rest of the world, internal social relations and internal institutions are being reconstructed. So, yeah, I thought I was trying to answer that question through that earlier answer. But there was a question from Robel that I thought maybe I could answer, because he said the students were, you know, the children of the feudal class, and I suppose I would have trouble delineating the student movement as such. I think that one would be hard pressed to simply say that all of the participants in the student movement were just children of, like, you know, this kind of upper echelon. Certainly what I'm trying to argue in looking at the journals and writings of the student movement is to think about how, again, internal class structures are being reconstructed because of the ways in which Ethiopia is being incorporated into a global capitalist world. And those students are becoming a new social formation or a new type of grouping because of that interaction with global capitalist forces. And I would see the articulations of those students as an attempt to struggle with that interaction, rather than to say that they're just simply, you know, the children of a feudal class. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have two general questions, not specifically intended for any of you, but general to the three of you. One from Samuel Tagai and another from Mikhail Kabede. So Samuel Tagai's general question is, how does one demarcate the modern from the pre-modern in Ethiopian historiography? Where do we draw the temporal line? On what basis? So that's one. The second from Mikhail Kabede is, what, if any, relationship do you think there is between the history and political economy of Islam in Ethiopia and the Ethiopian social construction of modernity? You want me to read them again? Okay. The first is from Samuel Tagai. How does one demarcate the modern from the pre-modern in Ethiopian historiography? Where do we draw the temporal line, and on what basis? So that's one. The second is from Mikhail Kabede. What, if any, relationship do you think there is between the history and political economy of Islam in Ethiopia and Ethiopia's official construction of modernity?
I can respond to perhaps the first. I mean, I think the typical historian's answer is that it begins with Tedros, not in the sense that he actually implements many of these modern things, but he's the first to have a kind of modernist view of incorporating technology and so forth. I think that's Baru's view. It's also Donald Crummey's view.
Yeah.
I mean, the establishment of Ethiopia as a modern nation state and modern Ethiopian nationalism could be an important marker. I don't know if that would be one important marker, but I would like, I mean, Santim, I think, was trying to say that, I mean, trying to see one landmark moment to start telling the story of modernity in Ethiopia would be quite difficult. But I mean, these are extremely interesting themes, I mean, to think around. For instance, the establishment of the modern nation state and, the emergence of modern Ethiopian nationalism would be interesting themes. The other important thing, I think, in understanding modernity in 20th century Ethiopia particularly, is the establishment of the autocratic imperial state, which is really a creation of the modern. It's not really a drag from the past. I mean, the conventional wisdom has it as, imperial rule. I mean, in Ethiopia is something that is received from, from many centuries in the past. But, I mean, if you look at the autocratic imperial state, particularly in the post-1941 period, it has a very different nature and character. For instance, in the way in which it organized bureaucracy, for instance. You see what I mean? The propaganda machine, language policy, etc. All these things are extremely interesting. So I thought these are interesting themes to think around in thinking about.
There's time for one question for Semene.
Yeah.
I found your paper quite interesting, but at the period that you were talking about in early 1974, my impression is the Derg is not united.
True.
So, but you talk continually about the Derg doing something or another. Can you de-aggregate that with struggles that are going on in the Derg, then that react to this kind of moralization? Do you know exactly who was writing these articles for Addis and what their position in the Derg? You see the kind of question I'm posing.
No, yeah, I see your question. You're right. I mean, Derg has to be disaggregated. I mean, you're right. But in terms of understanding the Derg between June and September and its moralist, state moralist impulse, I don't know if we see differences. For instance, I don't know if there was a difference between people like, Tafari Banti and Mengistu Haile during that time. I don't know about, with regards to the unwaged, it seems to me it's just a feeling, it's just a hunch. I don't have any evidence to substantiate my hunch with. But in terms of their understanding and relationship with the unwaged, I don't think they had any significant difference between them. But it is something open to question, maybe something to explore.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question, please?
Yes, please.
I tried, actually I tapped and sent it. It might have gone to one of the other panelists. But the question is this, it's for Semene. By the way, a great presentation. My question is very simple. You did mention that for your sources, you used newspapers and some other written sources like journals. What about using youth jokes? Because there are plenty of them. So have you considered using folklore as part of your, oral sources, especially jokes?
That's a great question. So I haven't really explored into that. So I was responding to a previous question, a very similar question to that of yours. So this is something that I would definitely be interested in looking at. So what I have used is official state papers, Addis Zaman, Yazari to Ethiopia, editorials, some statements made by the Derg itself, and police reports. So, I mean, trying to incorporate, youth jokes during that time would be extremely interesting.
Yeah, especially for finding out how the youth resisted.
Exactly.
I think one way of finding out or learning about the reactions is by looking at youth jokes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Mikhail's question is a very difficult question. I don't know how to answer.
Yeah, there is one last question, which is about if there is any relationship that it exists between the history and political economy of Islam in Ethiopia and the Ethiopians' official construction of modernity. Is there anyone who wants to?
We're out of time. We're out of time.
I know we do. Yes, we don't have time, but it's a very, very important question, and probably in a minute or so, if someone interested in responding to these.
Santim is out. She has the answers. I don't know if Donald has answers.
So it's good to wrap it up.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Chimelis, for moderating today's discussion. And thank you, Professor Donald and Professor Eleni and Professor Semeni for your presentations.